Welcome. This is Zürich and I'm a project consultant of the Preparatory Office for the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of the World Heritage Sites under the auspices of UNESCO. Pleasure to meet you all at the 2020 online lecture series on understanding World Heritage interpretation and presentation. Thank you very much for joining today's lecture. As all of you may know, the world is facing one of the biggest threats it has faced for decades. Until the day we can enjoy one sunny day out at sites with our friends and family. Hope you all stay safe and keep your concern and attention on the World Heritage sites by sharing the latest issues and your opinions on the sites online. And we hope the online lectures with World Heritage professionals offer you a great opportunity on that point. The 2020 online lecture series were held twice a month since last September. Please check the videos of the lectures by Neil Silverman, William Logan, Shmei Huang, and Wijie Zhu on our Facebook channel and YouTube channel. This month is the last month for the 2020 online lecture series, but we still have 2 more wonderful lectures with our World Heritage professionals. Today, we will have a lecture with Dr. Peter Bille Larsen, and there will be one more lecture with Dr. Gamini Wijasriya on 26 November. Please take a look at the Facebook page of the Preparatory Office for further information on the lectures. If you are joining the lecture on YouTube, you can find the link for the Facebook page on live streaming videos description. If you have any questions about the lecture, please leave comments on our YouTube or Facebook's live streaming video. We will have time for questions after the lecture. Now, I would like to give a brief introduction to our lecturer, Dr. Peter Bille Larsen. Dr. Peter Bille Larsen lectures in Anthropology, Heritage, Sustainability, and Governance at Universities of Geneva and Zürich. Primary fieldwork sites include Peruvian imaging, Vietnam, and global-level heritage processes. He works extensively with international organizations, NGOs, and community-based organizations in the heritage field to promote more inclusive and equitable approaches. Recent publications include World Heritage and Human Rights and World Heritage and Sustainable Development. Now, I'd like to turn the time over to our lecturer, Dr. Peter Bille Larsen. Pleasure to meet you, Professor. I think you're on mute.
Yes, sorry. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And indeed, thank you for the opportunity to be here among such a distinguished group of speakers. I'm humbled by it, but also indeed very happy to take up that challenge to actually respond to your request and an invitation to talk about minority inclusive World Heritage interpretation today. I've added a subtitle to that towards a balanced approach. I think we have a number of lessons that we can draw from the current situation, and that may also allow for reflections for the current, present, and the future about this topic. So let me start. And indeed, once again, thank you to the Preparatory Office for the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of World Heritage Sites to indeed draw attention to this important dimension. I think it's a crucial one, and I will hope that I'm sure that many in the audience will also agree to me that we need to address this even more than we're doing right now. So I think it's an excellent space for critical thinking and timing. And of course, in today's bigger political climate, we might say that minority matters matter. It's a wake-up call in the heritage field. We see numerous discussions taking place about what has been going on, recent events revealing that we have deep heritage legacies, numerous social discontents, as well as deep-running social inequalities, forms of violence, and hierarchies of voice. And these aren't necessarily new topics for the heritage field, but they're increasingly, pressingly important and part of current debates. So minority connections, we might say, they matter in different ways. And some of the key points in this respect are indeed the need to question current ideas often found in the heritage field of minorities as the exotic other, ideas of racialized difference, and in some respects, we cannot continue heritage as usual. So on the flip side of that is really thinking about heritage complexity and richness, and perhaps rethinking the way we think about that complexity and richness. And part of that, I think, connects us very much to that broader field of representation and interpretation. How do we actually rethink contemporary representations and what I would call rewrite? And here at the double play on writing and rights, rewrite forms of minority agency and subjects of decision making, rather than just consider minorities as objects of heritage making. So, but let's turn a bit broader, kind of zoom out a bit and think about what happens when minorities meet world heritage, and indeed what happens when heritage systems meet minorities. And within that, what is the role for interpretation? And what's the particular role for minority inclusive interpretation? And how should we actually consider, would we define that given the current context? But first of all, what do we actually mean by minorities? And that's not an easy, there's no easy answer to that. Indeed, there's no simple international definition we can rely on. And I would just here refer to a recent working definition by the UN Special Rapporteur on minorities, Fernand de Varenne, who speaks about ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities as any group of persons that constitute less than half of the population in the entire territory of a state, whose members share common characteristics of culture, religion, or language, or a combination of these. A person can freely belong to an ethnic, religious, or linguistic minority without any requirement of citizenship, residence, official recognition, or any other status. And I've chosen to put that in bold because, of course, we're dealing with forms of identity that are at times contested and at times not necessarily recognized by the given nation state, but that indeed, from the perspective of international human rights standards, that is not necessarily a requirement. Indeed, the issue here of self-identification is important, and I think that's important also when we talk about minority dynamics within the World Heritage System. It also belongs to the international system. I would also like to add to that definition, perhaps, for the matter of our discussion here and the heritage field, gender minorities, minorities with other sexual orientations, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex. In order to indeed emphasize this also as a critical dimension when we think about minorities in the heritage field. So again, I think here, the spirit here, and indeed this refers to dynamics also raised by Bill Logan and others in the previous presentations, is that of social inclusivity. And in this respect, once again here, the heritage field has a lot to offer. And indeed, I think this is also why I would encourage thinking of this as an inclusive approach, that also referring to the first conversation I mentioned, that we're not stuck in sort of the conflictive dimensions of definitional issue here, but we're open and try to be inclusive. Because indeed, even if we might say ethnic minorities in general are omnipresent all over the world, they're fairly invisible in the World Heritage sphere. I'm not saying they're completely invisible, as I'll come back to in a couple of moments. There are different ways that minorities are visibilized, but that is also a matter of discussion. But I think the crucial thing here is that we're talking about, obviously, people that can be found anywhere in the world, if you look at the kind of inclusive definitions that I've just encouraged us to think about in the World Heritage context. For example, minorities are clearly part of urban fabrics all over the world, religion, ethnicity, and it has huge important dynamics also in relation to spatial organization, but of course also matters of social stratification. We also see all over the world cases of multi-layered heritage sites that abound with indeed contested memories. Here's an emblematic case we've seen from India, for example, with the whole sort of process that was about reconstructing a temple in a case that had also been the site of a mosque that had been destroyed, I think back in 1902. So this is really part of reality all over the world. Heritage sites involving multi-layered perspectives, very often involving minority perspectives. And this made me think of the importance of really trying to sort of acknowledge and identify the multiplicity of minority heritage dynamics. And this is far from being exhaustive, but I wanted to just show the kinds of diversity of minority heritage dynamics that we see all over the world. For example, if we start from above, we have cases where minority heritage is directly targeted for destruction, deliberate destruction, targeting of ethnic minorities, even criminalization of minority heritage, and so on. Languages prohibited. So we've seen major cases with the Rohingya in Myanmar, for example, that where also the whole massive movements of people to flee the situation was also accompanied by deliberate destruction of heritage sites. We, of course, also have numerous cases where it's not a matter of just heritage being targeted, but indeed minorities themselves persecuted, as we just talked about, but even identities being perceived as a threat to the narratives or to the ideas of the particular nation state. And we've seen this with LGBTQ, but also in other cases. So I think it's important to acknowledge that this is one kind of minority heritage dynamic, and it's important to acknowledge that also because it indeed points to the high levels of potential conflict also that may be produced, and vice versa, the potential of heritage processes as peace-building dynamics. So this is something that we've addressed in a number of contexts, and I think something that urgently deserves much more attention. It's not as if the global dynamics currently are just oriented towards peace, and we have highly polarized dynamics in several contexts. Another dynamic of a minority heritage dynamics is that of invisibility. We've seen that in a numerous World Heritage contexts where minority heritage is part of the social cultural fabric, yet virtually invisible in terms of how the outstanding universal values are identified, in terms of how that heritage is being managed. Now, what happens in those kinds of invisibility, of course, depends on specific context, but we often see what we might consider collateral damage, basically having no conducive conditions to actually support ethnic minority stewards in taking up and working towards protecting their heritage. So in a sense, this may also lead to decay, lead to heritage loss. Indeed, that whole idea of ethnic minority heritage as living heritage suffers also in these kinds of invisibilized conditions. What's also interesting, of course, is that we increasingly see what I would call forms of partial recognition of minority heritage. In many countries, indeed, there's increasing emphasis on seeing minority heritage as part of what we might label the national heritage mosaic. Some kind of recognition that this is also part of the bigger cultural picture. And that we see in quite a few number of cases with different associated dynamics. Some of it is also considered as problematic. There are risks of this being of ethnic minority heritage or other minority heritage being reduced to matters of folklore. It's being reified, freezed in a certain way, and in many cases even commodified objects to trade in the market arena. And then I would say, lastly, there's also growing rights-based recognition of minority heritage, where indeed increasingly it's also about heritage as a tool for asserting collective rights, asserting identity recognition, and also reworking relationships with the nation state. And in this respect, we might also say that there's a growing space within the World Heritage field to acknowledge human rights-based approaches. And indeed, there's a whole and very important discussion to have about how minority rights can offer a framework for reworking minority heritage dynamics in the World Heritage arena. So I just want to give you that broader sort of set of arrangements, because it's not necessarily that they're all separate, but they certainly helps us to draw attention to different dynamics involved. Indeed, I would say that we also have a huge question of dynamics of polarization, conflict, and destruction taking place. Here is, of course, indeed a case, and this may range from the targeting of minority heritage to also World Heritage being targeted. We have a number of cases where heritage, in a sense, is being drawn into a crossfire. And I might actually say here that heritage and minorities are easy targets for extremism and easy targets for being drawn into conflicts. So this is obviously something that should immediately require that there is concerted and structural attention to the matters of interpretation as well. Now, how does all that fit into the World Heritage arena? We've already touched a bit upon it through the earlier slides, but I would then say again that it can fit in many different ways. And what are indeed then the possibilities and the potential for the quality, for good quality inclusive interpretation? Well, obviously, if we start to the left, if we're dealing with situations of targeted destruction, opposition, even persecution of minorities, that is obviously not a very conducive context for inclusive interpretation, or the types of interpretation would seem very paradoxical faced in a broader context of extreme marginalization. If we move further on to the right, indeed, when minorities are simply the commodified other, objects to be observed, sold, or even on a tourism path, that is not nor does that either open up for a very inclusive interpretation. There may be informed interpretation about minority concerns, histories, cultural histories, material histories, but it's not inclusive from a social perspective. In the case of invisibility, and here I have a picture of a site I've worked a lot in central Vietnam, where the OUV, I will get back to that as well, is based on natural values. Here, the ethnic minority heritage is fairly invisible. And that leaves a bit of a limbo in terms of actually having inclusive approaches and making the connection. As we move further to the right towards Mosaic recognition, we see multiple approaches actually indeed recognizing minority heritage, but the question is always on which conditions, whose voice, etc. I'll get back to that in a second. And finally, we have dynamics of inclusive interpretation that potentially are based on a framework of rights-based recognition, which as I will also discuss later, involves basically shifting minorities from being an object of heritage concern to being subjects of decision-making and thinking and agency in the heritage field. So we have that whole spectrum, and I think that that every site and every site manager will have reflections about how to think about this, and perhaps also rethink modalities of engagement and interpretation. Okay, so I would say as a start that the minority and world heritage relationship is an uneven one, and also potentially contradictory one, but also one that has scope for improvement and synergy building in certain contexts and under certain conditions, I would say. So let's look a bit into some cases and move forward. We have cases where ethnic minority culture is clearly a part of what has been defined as the outstanding universal value of given sites. Here, the old town of Lijiang, for example, which in its statement regarding the OUV for the site speaks about how this has resulted from cultural communication between groups such as the Naxi, the Han, Tibetan, and the Bai, involving social life, customs, arts, and crafts, etc. So in some respects, there are cases where indeed ethnic minority heritage is redefined as something that's of outstanding universal value. Now, we have other cases. Also, we have cases, for example, in the case of the Auschwitz and Birkenau, where the genocide is indeed important for understanding the OUV there in terms of the genocide of the Jews by the Nazi regime. And so in that sense, we have these cases where there's a clear link between minorities and the OUV. But then we also have cases, for example, where it's not so clear. So if we stick to the case of Auschwitz, for example, a number of people working on the intersection between LGBT and world heritage emphasize how that the site description of Auschwitz mainly refers to Jews, Roma, and the Sinti and other nationalities, but there's little reference, for example, to the persecution of homosexuals and the particularly degrading conditions that they faced. So in that sense, again, minority perspectives are somehow easily forgotten or left out. The case of Amsterdam, with a little vignette up in the top of the PowerPoint here, the OUV speaks of Amsterdam as a crucial center for intellectual exchange, dissemination of humanist thought. And then people have indeed also created what they call the Homo Monument to commemorate the persecution because of sexuality. So what becomes interesting is indeed that intersection or that connection between OUV and the particular historical experience, the lived experience, and the perspectives of minorities in different contexts. This is also important for natural heritage and cultural landscapes. Indeed, minorities are very much part of and live in areas that are sometimes defined as wilderness or considered cultural landscape, here from the Himalaya to the rice terraces of the Ifugao in the Cordillera in the Philippines and so on. Now, of course, I will not get into discussions on minorities and indigenous peoples here, but I do, of course, and that's also a kind of a shifting topic in the sense that indeed in a number of countries, the wording is used interchangeably, that certain ethnic minorities, for example, would qualify as indigenous peoples in international human rights language, and that raises a whole series of issues that I won't have time to get into here, but it's something to keep in mind. As I mentioned, indeed, in a number of natural contexts, these are deeply historically connected cultural landscapes that are easily silenced by the emphasis on natural, outstanding universal values. And that has a whole series of implications, which we have dialogued quite a bit about also in some of the areas that I have worked in and I continue to work in, because it does raise a number of questions about how to deal with that coexistence of different values and the constant risk of minority values and perspectives to remain marginal in the bigger picture, which is constantly driven towards the emphasis on outstanding universal values. The point here is that there's nothing natural about that silence. There's nothing natural about the silence of minority perspectives on heritage. It's rather about social and cultural hierarchies of value, different layers of meaning, but also stratified ideas of identity. Some identities matter more than others, etc. So this is something that we need to get better at tackling head on, because it's exactly about the dynamics of exclusion and inclusion, and the role that heritage and world heritage play in that respect. So on the one hand, there is that risk of heritage designation and management, reproducing histories of marginalization, reproducing contentious politics, reproducing and even exacerbating the kinds of potential conflicts that might arise out of that. Remember that earlier slide about polarization. Is heritage actually intensifying that dynamic of polarization, or can heritage from the other perspective involve new forms of recognition, forms of inclusion that allow for actually reconciling these different perspectives? But this is a key question and key dynamic. And I'm very thankful for the opportunity to actually address this here, because what we do see, and I want to insist upon this, is that minorities continuously face the risk of eviction, displacement, and marginality, also in World Heritage dynamics. And why is that? You know, we have increasingly now had for many years matters of community inclusion, community voice, and so on. And so why does this risk continue to be there? And part of the answer, I think, is that we're talking about structural dynamics, societal dynamics that are, in a sense, much deeper and much more entrenched than the sort of aspirations we might see in emerging World Heritage language. So what happens is that we have processes of designation, processes of gentrification, management, even private sector capture of benefits and so on, that leave minorities in a marginal position very often. We also have legacy issues. So that means both legacy issues and ongoing realities of minorities that may face insecure tenure, security, insecure, not very clear rights. I mean, we've seen a number of cases where even the citizenship of minorities has been contested in World Heritage site planning processes. This was, for example, the case, I believe, in the Karen in a Thai site, where their actual citizenship of the country was thrown into question. In those cases, what we see then is that official narratives, unless there is a strong safeguard framework, risk reproducing marginality rather than enabling reconciliation. And in that sense, heritage, once again, despite our aspirations for something else, may risk deepening discrimination rather than promoting inclusion. Now, that being said, there's also space for change and new narratives. Indeed, the question is then, how do we do that, and under which conditions do we enable that to take place? So I would say presentation and interpretation have key roles to play in that respect. The question is how it's done, what is being done, for whom it's being done, and by whom it's being done. It's about balancing forms of recognition. So just for the case of simplicity here, think of three spheres interacting: minority heritage, minority rights, world heritage. We might speak of cases where there's a so-called minor imbalance. Indeed, where in the bigger picture, what's being focused on is world heritage, and minority heritage is considered minor heritage compared to the OUV. And the consequences we've seen very often is that minority heritage is neglected compared to national and universalist narratives. As a consequence of that, it's under prioritized and it's underfinanced. As a further consequence of that is heritage loss, no? So, I mean, despite all the statistics we now have from ethnohistorians, ethnolinguistics about the drama, indeed a cultural crisis for certain minorities in terms of maintaining, sustaining, and reproducing culture, we actually see here the risk of world heritage dynamics furthering another push towards undermining minority heritage in the long term. The positive, well, not the positive, but the issue here is that it's a lost opportunity. It's a lost opportunity to use the World Heritage Framework to indeed strengthen and engage with heritage stewards in finding alternative ways of going about that. A different scenario is that of, we might say, is the multicultural minority mosaic heritage framework, no? Where we have in some countries some form of heritage pluralism, where minority cultures are recognized, leading to a kind of national mosaic heritage framework. Now, what we've learned from literature here is that that very often involves top-down, fragmented, partial recognition only, and there's a lot of critique about it being depoliticized. The question is recognition of what and on whose premises, and at the end of the day, you might have minority heritage recognized, yet wider processes of minority exclusion taking place at the same time. So that leaves a bit of a paradoxical situation, but of course also a space for reform and improvement. Another framework would be again, we have these three circles here, is the growing space for minority rights. And this is an important space to think about. Indeed, it's very much also about nation state frameworks within language of multiculturalism and rights are reforming constitutions, and in some places have tried to replace policies of assimilation with constitutional recognition and voice. So what we see there are growing rights spaces, legalized minority associations, collective action, allowing for their voice to be heard. Very often accompanied by both substantive and procedural rights, also when it comes to heritage. Now, those processes may not always be very well connected with the heritage field, and that what we have seen very often is indeed the need for a sensitization of the rights field and sensitization of the heritage field actors to actually figure out how that will work within the complexity of things like world heritage. Going down that line of talking about minority rights, one should of course also emphasize the 1992 UN Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious, or Linguistic Minorities, which states in Article 1 that states shall protect the existence and the national or ethnic, cultural, religious, and linguistic identity of minorities, encouraging conditions for the promotion of that identity. So it's very clear. This is a declaration. And we see that link here, of course, potential link between heritage and identity, which is even further emphasized, I would say, in Article 4, which speaks about state measures to create favorable conditions to enable persons belonging to minorities to express their characteristics and to develop their culture, language, religion, traditions, and customs. So this is all very good. And indeed, as we saw in 2005, when heads of state and government went, at the World Summit of the United Nations General Assembly came out with a statement, indeed saying that the promotion and protection of the rights of persons belonging to national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities contributes to political and social stability and peace and enriches the cultural diversity and heritage of society. So the bigger political ambition, the global ambition is there. We have a declaration, we have these statements, we have this framework. Now, what does all this mean in the context of what I call WHINterpretation, World Heritage Interpretation? Who, and I'm playing around with the WH letters here. So who is involved in WHINterpretation? Which identities on which premises? With what outcomes, no? And the bigger move here, which we've seen taking off in some cases, but needs further, I would say, policy framing in the World Heritage context, is that of taking minorities as objects of heritage making, expertise, and folklore towards being subjects, actors of identity, of decision making, and rights holders in the World Heritage process. So back to the initial question, what happens when minorities meet World Heritage? World Heritage system meets minorities. What role for interpretation in all of this? You might say, well, Peter, this is well beyond what we can actually do from our focus here on interpretation. And I would say indeed, well, wait a minute. Can't we reshape heritage making and think about inclusive reinterpretation as part of reconciliatory identity politics? I think it's absolutely essential. Heritage as a political process in that sense has a key role to play, and World Heritage and the UNESCO system at large, an even more important one in terms of the kinds of polarized politics and the marginal situation we see of minorities in so many countries. We have a choice to make, and I think it's important that we are conscious about those choices and that we really mobilize that strong ambition and will to action that we see in the heritage field. I would say that inclusive interpretation after this or during this process of Black Lives Matter is really a question about whether we are interested in enabling empowerment or we simply end up reproducing heritage as usual. Do we just play minority songs, or do we empower minority voice and participation in World Heritage? Do we simply enroll minorities as exotic stopovers on heritage tours, buy their artisanal products, or do we actually promote them as active stewards in management of their heritage and support their cultural identities? Is heritage reinforcing a folklore gaze, or does it try to actually help redress complex state minority histories, sometimes conflict, and move towards reconciliation? Now, interpretation, yes, has a role to play in this respect, but of course, we need to problematize what we mean by inclusiveness, inclusion, and we also need to look at how inclusive interpretation connects with underlying conditions. What heritage counts, whose voice counts, whose values, whose interpretation, which interconnections matter, what is presented. Indeed, as we've seen in this lecture series, as Neil Smith noted, there's little formal guidance on representation and interpretation in the World Heritage arena. Bill Logan also emphasized all of this as a matter of interpretation, meaning and values, political context, and different uses of heritage. We do see in the World Heritage operational guidelines then a double gap here. One is the gap in relation to interpretation, and the other is the gap in relation to minority rights. We have no direct reference to minorities in operational guidelines, while some progress has been made in terms of recognizing indigenous peoples and an emphasis on local communities. We have to acknowledge this as an important gap. Now, that being said, we do have the World Heritage and Sustainable Development Policy that calls for a cross-cultural sensitive approach to interpretation. And among other things, what's emphasized there is that the adoption of approaches to the interpretation of World Heritage properties that are of significance to various local communities and other stakeholders, particularly in the nomination process and when it involves managing heritage associated with conflicts. So here I think it's important that we acknowledge different rights holders and that process of acknowledgement as a vehicle for ensuring cross-cultural sensitivity. Indeed, if we're talking about cases of conflict, if we don't have that recognition, it's highly unlikely that that process can take place in an equitable way. So I think my time, I will leave some time open for discussion here and conclude in again, getting back to what I would say, the importance of rewriting heritage as a basis for minority inclusive World Heritage interpretation. We need to acknowledge minorities as distinct right holders that have particular perspectives on heritage. We need to acknowledge that this involves different values, different narratives, matters of representation, but that it also concerns governance and resources. Notably, once we think about governance dynamics in relation to how management systems are put in place, whose voice matters, and how to actually create mechanisms that genuinely engage with minorities as a matter of good faith. And for that to happen, inclusion will require that approaches to interpretation that acknowledge and sort of build on, but also try to work out of wider processes of exclusion. So that whole reflection process fundamentally for inclusive minority heritage or minority inclusive World Heritage to take place, for that to be reconciliatory, we'll have to have a strong emphasis on empowerment and allowing for voice. So to finish about this idea of rewriting, it's not just about rewriting the contents in terms of heritage interpretation and presentation. It's also about rewriting the forms, the mechanisms, and the effects. What is being said, through which means, and with what consequences. So I think I will basically stop here and open up for discussion. And thank you again for the opportunity, indeed, to be able to undertake this presentation as part of the lecture series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful lecture. Really, we highly appreciate for your lecture. As you mentioned, we all know the importance of minority inclusive interpretation, but minorities are still fairly invisible in this field. So hope we can make balanced World Heritage interpretation for all without leaving anyone behind. And there are some questions our participants left on our Facebook's and YouTube's live streaming video. And apologize for participants who is watching this lecture on Facebook, because it has been there has been a internet connection error, but it will be uploaded on YouTube in a clear version, and we will also upload a clear version on our Facebook channel too. And now let's move on to the Q&A session. And there was a first question from Hyungyung Lee on our YouTube channel. And the first question was, thanks for your wonderful presentation. It is such a significant and timely topic. It is so important to consider the value of minority into the OUB in the heritage interpretation. However, the heritage value of the minority is quite vulnerable. For example, the example of the old town of Lijiang that you suggested is used to support Chinese nationalism. Also, racists or sexists often ridicule the value of minority in the World Heritage Sites. How can the minorities' value of World Heritage Sites can be protected? Do you think that it is time for UNESCO to consider providing the ethical guidelines or including the matter to the operational guidelines? Okay, that was quite a long question, and it was the first question.
Oh, it's a very interesting one indeed. I mean, without going into the details of specific cases, but what the question reveals indeed is that each case potentially presents the risk, of course, of the minority sort of heritage being either ignored or potentially being used for other purposes, whether it's political or whether it's economic or social purposes and so on. And I think it's absolutely essential, and I think the literature on the World Heritage field has clearly now acknowledged this for a number of years, that the dynamics of politicization that are taking place are currently fueling certain forms of exclusion and sort of heritage system, the risk of being co-opted rather than actually, enabling a more inclusive dialogue around identity matters and social inclusion and so on. And that's counterproductive. I mean, it's counterproductive in relation to the overall sort of UNESCO framework. It's counterproductive in relation to sort of wider UNESCO standards on cultural diversity. And of course, it's also counterproductive towards building cohesion between heritage frameworks and the human rights framework. So for the question about strengthening further guidance on this, I would say absolutely. I would affirm guidance being one of several different enabling conditions to consider. I mean, guidance has that ambiguous role that I think I've tried to write and talk about over a number of years, that guidance can be used in so many different ways, and there is always that risk in the international sphere of having sort of a constant proliferation, production of meta norms, of guidance and further guidance. At the end of the day, not necessarily transforming things. But so this is something that needs to be, really tailored very carefully to make sure that also states parties that are working in the World Heritage system have a clear framework and know that when it comes to matters of minorities, interpretation and wider forms of engagement, that there are clear criteria and basically requirements and safeguards for that relationship. And we're not there yet. And I think indeed that given also wider global political climates, we cannot sort of just step back and say, well, it's kind of good enough what we have. I think there's really a need for a much more proactive approach. Guidance may be part of that, but indeed also further criteria and also perhaps discussions within the World Heritage Committee about how to really create an enabling framework for this to change. So thank you again for that question.
Thank you for your answer, and thank you for your question, Hyung-Gyeong. And there was a second question, and I will read the second question. The question was, the minority group's voice tends to be scattered, which makes them in a weak position. How can they condense them and have one powerful voice?
That's an excellent question. Indeed, we know a number of contexts where of course social marginality may also be combined with geographical marginality, and the two sort of reinforce each other, unfortunately, which means that when you have the World Heritage system embarking with technical missions coming out and so on, it's very difficult, even sometimes when there's a strong commitment and interest from the people involved, to actually reach these people. There are often questions of language as well, and of course, when you're talking to people who sometimes are disconnected information-wise and capacity-wise, it's very difficult for them to actually jump in and understand the implications of what World Heritage means and how to actually have that conversation, even if one is asked. And that requires, a complete rethink, I think. I think if we indeed say we're adopting a rights-based approach, then these minorities have the right to be informed properly, and that there's a need for supportive mechanisms, taking the time necessary to inform what the potential issues are, what the opportunities for engagement are, and how to actually also support their organization. Mechanisms for engaging where people are spread out in distant areas and so on. That's something that requires, I would say, a case by case design and adaptation. There's no, what works in India doesn't necessarily work in Canada, etc. So we need to constantly just make sure, and there's plenty of work on this, but the matter is indeed one of basically, again, ensuring that the right processes are in place that can allow it to emerge, for each distinct case. So, and this is something that I feel, again, the variation is huge, of course, and especially, it can go from highly organized people with organizations, highly literate, internationally connected, whatnot, to people who are voiceless, or not perhaps even are very literate in national languages. So the different conditions are massive, and so no blueprint is possible. But I think what we need to do is create an enabling framework in the World Heritage field to allow for it to take place equitably.
Yeah, equitably. Thank you for your answer. And I think there's another question. The question was, there have been a few exhibitions on minority perspectives, such as indigenous people in museums. I think it is a good way to communicate with the public, representing their voice. And what else can we present the minority groups' rights and their narrative on the heritage? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting field to actually engage in. I do think that museums can play a very important role, educative role. They can also and transforming or reifying minority culture in ways that perhaps do not represent how contemporary minorities see themselves. So what can museums do? I think there's a huge movement going on in the museums world to again rethink how to actually engage minorities themselves, also in framing what is being put forward, rather than just leaving them as objects of to be presented through the expert voice of museum officials. And I think there's a huge movement in the museums community to actually reach out and have those conversations, in a sense. And one of the dilemmas there for some officials, at least, has been requirements to sort of stick to the collections they already had, valorize collections. And then I've often had that conversation about how museums officials are struggling with somehow being kept as hostages of their collections. And what I see now increasingly are museums officials that are taking that, sort of saying, okay, we take that as a basis, but also seek to contextualize earlier collections and so on as part of a colonial, sometimes, arrangement, and really trying to rethink that arrangement, and also decolonialize, in a sense, matters of presentation and interpretation. So that again is about who actually, at the end of the day, has the voice, the authoritative voice to speak about what's being presented and how. And perhaps there, if we make that connection between museums and world heritage and living heritage, there are so many ways that I think that whole space can potentially be reformed. But we also need, of course, to acknowledge the deep running legacies here, and also the risks of you know, very problematic sometimes representations that have very little to do with the kinds of lives, issues, and ideas and voices that minorities might have today. So that whole sort of space, I think, is absolutely fascinating, but again is already in a process of dealing with legacies and dealing with a rethink of itself. And in a sense, perhaps museums have had that discussion longer than discussion has been had in world heritage, which, you know, in some respects has been caught up a bit in this global vision of having universalist ideas and protecting something for the wider world, which has sort of disabled a more, I would say, productive engagement with the multiple layers involved. But that's all coming back very strongly now. So I think the momentum is there, and we shouldn't lose it, because if not, again, the risk is that world heritage systems basically end up reproducing heritage as usual, rather than actually enabling more inclusive dialogues with the people that often live in these areas. Thanks for the question.
Thank you for insightful answers for all those questions our public participants left, Professor. And there are so many questions our participants left on our YouTube channel and Facebook page, but due to lack of time, I think we need to stop Q&A session for today's lecture. And really, once again, highly appreciate for your wonderful lecture and your warm support on lecture series. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I would be very happy to see all the questions, in fact, and I don't know if we can find an alternative way, or if you think we can add for another couple of minutes, I'm also happy to do that. But if not, then find a way of at least communicating the questions to me, or otherwise I would also encourage people that are interested in this matter, please to reach out, and then they're welcome to contact me through my university contact details. So it shouldn't be too hard to find me. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you all for thank you for your wonderful lecture, and we highly appreciate you all the participants for joining today's lecture of the online lecture series on World Heritage Interpretation and Presentation. And the final lecture of the 2020 online lecture series under the agenda Comprehensive World Heritage Interpretation will be held on 26 November. And on that day, Dr. Gamini Wijasriya, who also left a comment on today's lecture saying that, I'm sorry, I'll read it quickly. He left a comment on today's lecture saying, "Congratulations, my friend." And Now, Gaminis Rio will have its lecture on 26th November, and it will be held at 3 p.m. KST and 7 a.m. CET. Please check the Facebook page of the Preparatory Office for further information on the lecture. Thanks again for joining us today, and I hope you all stay safe and healthy, and see you all in the next lecture. Thank you.